Good afternoon, buenas tardes, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan, Miami Book Fair, and all of us at Books and Books in Miami, Florida, I welcome you to a virtual program with James Carroll to discuss The Truth at the Heart of the Lie, How the Catholic Church Lost Its Soul, an eloquent memoir by a former priest and National Book Award-winning writer who traces the roots of the Catholic sexual abuse scandal back to the power structure of the church itself as he explores his own crisis of faith and journey to renewal. James Carroll served as Catholic chaplain at Boston University from 1969 to 1974. He left the priesthood to become a writer, and for 23 years he wrote a weekly op-ed column for the Boston Globe. He has written 12 novels and 9 works of nonfiction, including his memoir, An American Requiem, winner of the National Book Award, Constantine's Sword, a New York Times bestseller and winner of the National Jewish Book Award, and A History of the Pentagon, House of War, winner of the Penn Galbraith Award. Carroll is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has always had a commitment to social justice and was one of the founders of the group Writers Against Trump, which is now Writers for Democratic Action and meets on a regular basis. To moderate this afternoon's conversation, we're joined by Reverend Dr. Laurie Hafner. Laurie's passion for prophetic ministry, the social gospel, and the arts has been the mark of her vibrant ministry. Called as senior pastor of Coral Gables Congregational United Church of Christ in 2006, Laurie came from Cleveland, Ohio, where she served congregations for 28 years, among them as senior pastor of Pilgrim Congregational United Church of Christ for 18 years. Pastor Laurie, as she is known, has been a great friend to Books and Books throughout the years, having opened the doors of the church to us for countless author events and signings. We miss being there, and we hope we can return sometime very soon. Throughout this afternoon's broadcast, you're all invited to ask questions by clicking the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of The Truth at the Heart of the Lie from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Hello.
Hello, everyone. And thank you, Christina, for such a nice introduction. And James, it's so lovely to see you. I would just like to begin, as I always do, with a word of thanks to Books and Books for being such an extraordinary locally owned bookstore that enriches all of our lives in this community in so many ways. James, I know you know Mitch, and you know that we have been truly blessed to have him as part of our community, as well as Christina and all of the staff as well. And James, it is such a privilege to be with you today. I've admired you from afar for many years, so it's an honor to have a conversation with you. And I am so grateful for this book. It is rich, it is meaningful, it's filling and fulfilling. And to be honest, it has hit me in such a personal way as I have been reflecting on my 40-some years of ordained ministry. So I'd like to begin, if it is okay with our conversation, with just a brief personal story. I'm a child of the Protestant church, and a Protestant church which is deeply rooted in the Reformed tradition. So my understanding of the Catholic Church is minuscule, mostly from some adored colleagues and beloved friends who are priests or former priests. One very dear friend, a former teacher of Catholic theology who left the church to become ordained in our denomination. And from the many new members who come to our church, about 60% of them who come out of a Catholic tradition. Well, years ago, when I was a pastor in an urban area of Cleveland, our neighbor church was this wonderful Catholic congregation that was run by a priest and a nun. And apparently the diocese just kind of left them alone and let them do things in their own manner. They were the church who embraced and welcomed the physically challenged, the emotionally challenged, those who lived with mental illness. Well, it was an anniversary of our partnership as two neighborhood churches, and they invited me to bring words to their morning worship. Well, the newspaper the next day picked it up and said that I had offered the homily that day. Well, the day after the article ran that I had offered the homily, there was a retraction in the paper that said I had merely brought words of greeting. And I tell you this because it gave me some insight into the church, but also brought up questions of call and pain, of power and courage, all of which I'd like to explore with you this afternoon. So, if you don't mind, let's begin with the question of call. You say right straight ahead that one's call to the priesthood stakes everything on the existence of God, and that if God does not exist, the vowed life of the monk, priest, or nun makes no sense. So I'm wondering if you would be so kind as to talk about your call and your sense of that call yet today, or how it manifests itself in your life yet today.
Well, Pastor Laurie, thank you for that really beautiful, beautiful statement culminating in that important question. If I could, in parenthesis, begin by acknowledging my gratitude to you. Christina used the word blessing, and I feel a blessing to be in conversation with you. I'm full of gratitude and respect for your prophetic ministry, and you honor me in my book by doing this today. I also need to say in this parenthesis how grateful I am to Books and Books, Christina, for the great introduction and arranging our conversation, but also to the great Mitch Kaplan, who's the prophet of this bookstore and its tradition, but a longtime hero to those of us who are writers. Mitch Kaplan has made a huge difference in the life of countless writers and, of course, readers everywhere. So what a good afternoon for me to be with you all. So to take your observation and question seriously, Laurie, the call. You know, I recount in this book the story of my own experience of that. I was a boy, a little boy, 7, 8, 9 years old, when I first had a sense of the religious life into which I was being introduced by my parents. And the figure of the priest and the nun were very important to me. I grew up in an Irish Catholic parish, and the world was defined by the goodness of the priest and the nun. And the truth is, I was a good boy, well behaved. I knew how to take orders. My father was in the military, that helped. I knew how to say yes, sir, yes, sister, and yes, father. But there was a way in which, at a pretty early age, I began to feel singled out. Looking back on it now, I recognize kind of the ancient human impulse to be special. We all have it. In my case, it took a religious form, and I did feel eventually called by God. My book is about the mistake that some religious people make, and certainly some of us Catholics have made it, in taking that experience of the call and using it to separate a certain group of people from everybody else. They're called and they're not. Many are called, but few are chosen. We're chosen, you're not. Chevy Chase used to do an opening of Saturday Night Live. Are you old enough to remember when Chevy Chase began Saturday Night Live? And he began the newscast every week, where he pretended to be the newscaster, by saying, "Good evening, I'm Chevy Chase and you're not." Every week we laughed at that. Why were we laughing? Because he was making fun of this impulse to define ourselves positively by defining somebody else negatively. In the Catholic tradition, that infected the way priests understood themselves. And that's what I'm writing about. The occasion for the writing, of course, is the terrible scandal of priests abusing children, a minority of priests, but a lot of them, and the bishops protecting the predators instead of the victims. All the bishops, practically, protecting the predators instead of the victims. That has been the source of a tremendous disillusionment for many of us Catholics and a scandal to people outside the Catholic Church. And that's what prompts my book. But it goes back to the very point you began with, the call. When Catholic priests began to take the call as a source of power, putting them on a pyramid structure of power, Pope, bishops, priests, lay people at the bottom, something poisonous came into the life of the church. It's an old story. You're a Protestant, I'm a Catholic. The Protestant Reformation was responding to some of this, even all those hundreds of years ago, as you know. I've been lucky enough to live, and let me just close this opening thought with this, in the period of the Catholic Church's life that began with the Second Vatican Council in the early 1960s, when I was a seminarian. And that defined my understanding of myself as a Catholic. And what was the overwhelming purpose of the Second Vatican Council? It was to finish with the Reformation. It was to end the disunity that had broken the body of Christ, the Christian churches, into antagonistic and competing entities. And I have been a Catholic of the Second Vatican Council ever since. So that's a special reason for my pleasure in being in conversation with you, my fellow, what are we, sons and daughters of Jesus Christ, my fellow believer, and our own little act of Christian reunion here. Laurie, what do you think?
I couldn't agree with you more. And I'd like to go back in a few moments to talk about the Second Vatican, because I know that had deep influence over you. And I think you probably had a lot of hope with Pope Francis that he might be the one to lead the Catholic Church to the continuation of that Second Vatican's vision and witness and so forth. But first, I'd like to talk a little bit more about power, because that is a theme that seems to run through your book, and that the sense of that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that even good intended priests or perhaps nuns or clergy, they come in maybe with a sense, just like we see with maybe our politicians or our attorneys and so forth, with an intent to help or to be better. And then something seems to happen. And that what seems to happen is this power. And it's hard to, once you've experienced that, to let go of that. So could you talk a little bit more about the power? Because you talked about it in terms of the monk. You started your book off about meeting the monk, and you knew there was something going on here, and how your mother was so taken with him, and that there was that overarching theme of power.
It's true. Let me say, first of all, as a Catholic, I'm talking about, in my criticism of the church, the power structure. And the first thing I want to lift up, of course, is that when we say Catholic, James Joyce famously wrote in Finnegan's Wake, Catholic means here comes everybody. There are more than 1 billion Catholics around the world. Think of that, more than 1 billion Catholics crossing every boundary, rich, poor, north, south, illiterate, highly intellectual, everything, class, you name it. And the vast majority of those people are living the lives of service and justice, especially those who are devoted to bringing relief and education and food and medical treatment to those most needing it around the world with no strings attached. That's the Catholic Church, the largest NGO in the world. That's the first thing I want to say about it. But the power structure, centered in Rome, the Vatican, has proven itself in recent years not to be worthy of those people. And that's my painful challenge. Power. The temptation to power is universal. Every human being feels it. Most human beings never have the opportunity or the occasion to exercise power, a real control over other humans. But some do. And some wreak havoc in the lives of other human beings in the name of power. The Christian movement begins when Jesus chooses service over power, and his rejection of power gets him killed by the power structures of his day. That's the beginning of our movement, the choice of service over power. Now, we're all human beings. That's the problem. Well, that's the good news and the bad news both, isn't it? But the bad news is we're all vulnerable to the temptation of power. And we see that through history. In fact, history is the record of people choosing power over service. The great manifestation of that in my lifetime was the horrible revelations that took place during the Holocaust, which is when the Christian world was revealed as complicit in lethal Nazi anti-Semitism. Not just the Catholic Church, the Christian churches generally, in part because Christians had been teaching anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish tropes down through the centuries, which came into a new and horrible form in the 20th century, but also then by being silent and complicit as the Holocaust unfolded. The Catholic Church recognized that failure. People, our viewers today, readers, may not, there's no reason most people should know this, but when I talk about the Second Vatican Council, a gathering of all the world's Catholic bishops that took place in 4 sessions from 1962 to 1965, those bishops, conservative men presiding over the most conservative institution, put aside their commitment to their own dignity and power to reckon with their great failure that was laid bare only a few years before, when the Nazis nearly succeeded in the genocide of the Jewish people. And the Second Vatican Council responded by renouncing anti-Jewish Christian theology, which was the source of anti-Semitism in the West. The Christ killer myth, charging the Jewish people with the murder of Jesus. Hello, it was the Romans who killed Jesus. And the idea that the Christian church has replaced the people of Israel in the favored sight of God, meaning Israel and Jewish religion is outmoded and to be left behind. That was basic Christian teaching, Catholic, Protestant, Martin Luther, down through the centuries. The Second Vatican Council renounced that, the single largest change in Christian theology in history. I'm calling for a lot of changes in the church today. Ordain women, ordain married priests, get over the Catholic neurosis about sexuality, affirm the equality of women in every context, renounce the clerical power of priests and bishops over lay people, etc. None of those changes, Laurie, go nearly as deep into the Christian imagination as the changes in anti-Jewish theology that the church made in the early 60s. That's where I began my life, my real life as a Catholic. I came of age in that, and I haven't let go of it. And you've referred to Pope Francis. Absolutely. When Pope Francis came on the scene, a lot of us thought the vision of Vatican II, which the subsequent popes, after the great John the 23rd died prematurely, the popes after him panicked. Why did they panic? Because what they were being forced to confront was the corruptions of the power structure on which they were all arrayed, exercising power over people, which they liked. People in power always like it. And people in power can never be trusted to reform themselves. they'll always find ways to preserve their power. And sure enough, the subsequent popes rolled back the reforms begun at the Second Vatican Council. And the reason they did was simple. The opposite of patriarchy, which the Catholic Church embodies, is not matriarchy, it's democracy. And the movement to become a democratic institution, small d, meaning accountable, transparent, service instead of power, that movement was halted. Pope Francis offered a new day where some of us could see the possibility that the movement would be continued. And by and large, Pope Francis has done it. He's been a heroic figure, in my view, and the world has loved him for it. His defense of migrants, his defense of the environment, his insistence on the importance of democracy, his absolute commitment to lifting up the poor and reminding us all that we cannot just treat the impoverished of the world like garbage, which is his word. So Pope Francis has been a tremendous breath of fresh air. The one failure in Francis's papacy has to do with his own power in the church, the power of bishops and priests, because he has failed to readjust the structures of power that were laid bare by the priest sex abuse scandal, which Pope Francis, alas, has not nearly adequately dealt with yet. And that's really what prompted my work here.
And I'd like to dig a little bit deeper in that. I find it somewhat ironic when Pope Francis came into the position, there seemed to be this sense of great anticipation, and those in the progressive side of the Roman Catholic Church seemed to think this is going to be the change that we've been waiting for and looking for. And even folks who had come into my tradition here for a while to hang their spiritual hat said, I may be having the opportunity to go back into the church in which I had my birth and my growth and so forth, because Francis is different. He talks mercy. He seems calm. He washed the feet of Muslims. He's a scientist, no less. So have this great thing. But you said that what happened in Ireland, and you may want to, for those who haven't read the book, maybe James, you'll just give a little glimpse of that this was the thing that took you from the church. This was the thing that kind of sprung the wires, you said, to reassess and to think about the church, that here's this progressive individual, but it was him that finally made you think, this is not where I belong. And I just want to talk about, and what you said also about that, is that his time in Ireland was less of a betrayal as it was a sign of pressure that he was under it. And it makes me think about, where is courage today? We hear that with our politicians too, that they don't really believe that, especially folks in the conservative wing of politics. They don't really believe what they're saying, but they're under pressure to say this and so forth. Can we find courage if it's not in our clergy, if it's not in our churches, if it's not our politicians? Where do we find folks to lead the way?
Well, I think Pope Francis has shown great courage, actually, in all those ways I just mentioned. It takes courage to stand against this worldwide tide of anti-democratic, xenophobic, hyper-nationalist, hyper-populist movements. And he has gotten a lot of pushback, both from outside the church and inside the church. But you refer, the story I tell about Ireland is where, you're right, that image I used, Ireland is where something in me snapped. It was the summer of 2018. People may have noticed or read a little bit that in that summer, August, I think it was, Pope Francis made a pilgrimage to Ireland. Ireland was in the throes of the worst hours of the pre-sex abuse scandal. Something called the Ryan Report had been issued, an investigation into the Catholic Church's administration of schools, orphanages, homes for unwed mothers, Catholic institutions. And the Ryan Report laid bare that hundreds, thousands of children had been abused by clergy, even by some sisters. At the same time, the so-called Magdalene laundries were exposed. The Magdalene laundries referred to homes for unwed mothers, which turned out to be slave labor camps in which women were forced into servitude by the church. These reports were a scandal in Ireland, and the Irish people had a collapse of faith unlike anything I've ever heard of, where only a few years before, dozens of young men were ordained to the priesthood every year. Now, a handful, where before churches were always full of everybody from old to young, middle age, everybody. Now, churches are empty. It used to be when an Irish person walked past the church, they would bless themselves as a sign of respect. Now, they look the other way out of hurt and disillusionment. Pope Francis had to know this. We expected when he went to Ireland, that would be the place where he would lay out a major church response to the pre-sex abuse scandal. The scandal that a minority but many priests were abusing children, and the scandal that almost all the bishops protected the predators, as I said before. Pope Francis said nothing effectively about it. He expressed shame and sorrow, kind of usual bromides, but there was no announcement of real church reform. He got pushback, and so a little while later he announced that he would make a step. And what was the step? He was going to call a meeting of bishops to discuss the protection of children. Imagine a meeting of bishops called the Protection of Children meeting. Hello. The bishops are the problem, Laurie. The bishops have been protecting that pyramid of power and their own place on it. The bishops have been protecting the predators instead of the victims. Calling the bishops to deal with this problem alone would be like, and I say this in the book, putting mafia chieftains in charge of the crime commission. And sure enough, they met. And sure enough, they issued a report. It was called, "You Are the Light of the World." And it announced the Catholic Church's, at long last, response to the pre-sex abuse crisis. No response at all. Business as usual. They required clergy and bishops to report instances of abuse. Yes, they required that. But to whom? To other bishops. There was no place for lay people formally required to be in the process. There was no requirement of transparency. There was no mandated penalties for abuse or its cover-up. Bishops policing bishops. It's the ultimate instance of the clerical power structure I'm criticizing. When Pope Francis presided over this act of denial, that's when something in me snapped, because he's as good as they come. I love this man. As a writer, I've written in his defense and celebration of him all these 8 years that he's been Pope, until now.
Yeah. Could we talk a little bit more about him in terms of, he early on talked about, who am I to judge? He talked a lot about that with different, and I think folks in the gay community felt a sense of comfort that maybe this is the one who was going to embrace them and to give them entree into the church to be fully actualized and accepted and welcomed. But recently, he seemed to turn his back on all of that. Could you talk just a little bit more about that?
Well, we see in Pope Francis a man responding to the pressures against change and the pressures that come from outside, from reactionary elements in the church. Remember, the church isn't people forget that the church is actually like the United States Senate. I mean, there's a liberal wing and a conservative wing, and it's kind of paralyzed right now. The conservative wing is pushed back against Francis big time, but also influencing him is his own life, long life history. He's in his 80s, long life history of being in the clerical culture, of taking that pyramid of power for granted. Yes, when he became Pope, one of the first things we noticed was he was asked about gay people in the priesthood by a reporter. What do you make of gay people in the priesthood? Paraphrasing what the reporter asked. And his answer, spontaneous, right from his heart, was, who am I to judge? And he said, when God looks at a gay person, what does God see? God sees God's own creation. And we know that God loves his own creation. Well, as you say, flash forward to a few weeks ago, when the Vatican, it was issued in the name of the Vatican. Pope Francis didn't say it, but he's in charge. The Vatican issued a statement, a declaration, a command, forbidding Catholic priests from blessing gay marriages. And it wasn't just forbidding the blessing of gay marriages. It went further than that. It actually said, God does not bless sin. God does not bless sin. There was a cruel, dismissive, insensitive, unmerciful quality to that statement that was shocking, even to people who love Pope Francis, like I do. Pope Francis's watchword has been mercy. He published a book called The Name of God is Mercy. Beautiful book. There was no mercy in the Vatican statement of a few weeks ago. And that actually, for me, is a symbol of the disappointment I'm writing about. It's one of the reasons so many Catholics are alienated from the authority structure of the church. And it's why many people have left the Catholic Church. Laurie, the largest religious denomination in the United States are Roman Catholics. Do you know what the second largest is? It's former Roman Catholics.
Yeah.
I'm not kidding.
I'm sure.
Former Roman Catholics. And why is that?
Yeah.
And those are people of conscience, many of them, if not most of them, who simply said, this is wrong, and I'm not going to associate with it. And I'm calling on Catholics who've stayed and Catholics who've left to stay with this church and fight to change it. And I'm especially calling on priests and people who work for the church to act politically to change it. What do we do in the United States when fascism threatens us? We respond politically. We organize voter rallies. We get out to vote. We get candidates we can support. We make demands. We get into the streets. That's what you do to bring about change. The Catholics need to think politically about the corruptions of our church that have become so plain. What will it take? The Holocaust forced a major change in the 1960s. This isn't the Holocaust, what we're dealing with now, but it is the rape of children. When will that require us to change? That's my question.
I've always hoped and believed that the Christian church, and I use that in a wide berth here, has a proclivity to do what's right when pushed, but it has to be pushed. And you see that time and time again. And you kind of talk in the book about it's going to be the lay leadership. It's going to be folks within the church as well as clergy, but it's going to have to be kind of a grassroots, if I'm interpreting it right, organizational thing. Could we talk just a moment in light of all of that about President Biden, who brings his Catholicism to bear, but I don't see him towing what would I say the company line on a lot of things. Is he a symbol of what could be in the future?
Well, let me actually try to go a little below the surface of Joe Biden, if it's not presumptuous of me, and why I recognize him as a Catholic. It isn't actually because of his church going or his background. It's because of his deep, compassionate temperament. What is our religion, Laurie? What are we saying with our religion? Are we saying that God watches over the world, and when people step over the line and make a mistake, God damns them to hell? Well, that's what they were telling me when I was a kid. And that's what the Christian tradition has emphasized a lot, Catholic and Protestant both. But actually, that doesn't have much to do with the message of Jesus, or for that matter, the message of Moses. What was it? God doesn't condemn us to suffer because we deserve it. God joins us in suffering. That's what Moses came down from the mountain to report to the enslaved Hebrew people. God is with us, and therefore we can leave this slave condition and we can go into the wilderness. Why? Because God is with us. God doesn't condemn us to slavery, and God doesn't condemn us to the wilderness. God comes with us. That's how the story begins, the biblical story. God is with us in suffering. Jesus is a Jew who's telling us God is with us in suffering. Jesus doesn't suffer to redeem the world, to pay off the debt. Jesus suffers because we all suffer, even to death. And in the pandemic, with 500,000 or more Americans dead, when have we ever felt this more painfully? And what happened to us this year? A man showed up with power given to him by the people, whose first act, what was President Biden's first act as president? It was to suffer with us. On the evening before his inauguration, do you remember what he did? He stood at the Lincoln Memorial with Vice President Harris. A couple of people sang Amazing Grace, Leonard Cohen's magnificent Hallelujah. And then a light was illuminated for every 1,000 of the 300 plus thousand who were dead of COVID at that point, a long time ago. It's only yesterday, and we've lost 200,000 more. And you may remember how in front of the Lincoln Memorial, going all the way down the reflection pool to the Washington Monument, those lights went on. What was that? It was a wake. Mourning people who had been ignored and denied for a year. All of those hundreds of thousands of dead COVID victims and the millions of family members who love them felt somebody standing with them in their suffering. And then what did Biden do the next day? He didn't give an inaugural address, actually. He gave a eulogy. He talked to us about what all those folks we'd lost meant and how we had to honor them by changing the way we're living. And do you remember what he did then? Instead of going to the big banquet, which is the tradition after the inauguration, he joined the other living presidents, except one, at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Arlington, laying a wreath in silence. That was the burial, the committal. We had a wake, we had a eulogy, we had a funeral. America, desperately in grief, needed a funeral, and we got one from this president. Now, these were deeply human responses, but as a Catholic, I knew just where Joe Biden got the intuitions that led him to that. Suffering with, God suffers with us. Suffering with, the Latin word for suffering with is compassion. And that's what Joe Biden represents to me. And I believe we, the United States of America, are desperately lucky that we have this man as our president right now. And
So
that's the only partisan note I'm going to strike.
So, so well said. And you talked a lot about in your early days of tending to funerals and being the altar boy at funerals, and the deep influence and the power of death over life, or life over death, and the meaning behind that, and this image of suffering, and certainly of the suffering Christ, the suffering world. And you're right, it is powerful if we use it well. And I'd like to think that in your portrayal of what President Biden has done, he has used it well. I have so many other questions, but let me go to some questions that are emerging here so that other folks can participate in this conversation. One teacher has just kind of talked about that in her Gender and Sexuality Alliance Club at this all-girls Catholic high school where she's a teacher, that they were deeply disappointed in Pope Francis not recognizing gay marriage. And she's wondering, what does she say to them when they're inclined to become part of that former Catholic group, rather than perhaps staying and maybe changing from within?
Well, first of all, let me salute that teacher and what he or she is doing. Such important work. Those students are lucky. I think that we have to respect everybody's conscience, including the conscience of children, about religious faith, and salute people who make a conscientious choice. And if that choice is to leave a denomination behind, or religion itself behind, or to discover the meaning of life in ways that do not include language about God or the other world, we not only salute that because people are free to do that, but we salute it because, excuse me, that represents the truth. Because whether you're religious or not religious, none of us are in charge of the mysteries of transcendence. We don't know what is beyond us. So we put into words our intuitions about it, and some of those words are called religion. Others of those words are called poetry, and others are called music, and others are called the work of scientists. All of this is an attempt to surpass what we know into something future. Meanwhile, there is this tradition of religious response to the unknowable. All we know about God, really, is that God is unknowable. And so we have this flawed, limited way of honoring God. Everything we say about God has to be checked and criticized because it isn't God. Having said all of that, that means to me that we're always going to be involved in flawed human institutions. If I thought there was a perfect church out there, yours, for example, I would join it. But I suspect that even though my own church has a particular corruption right now, and yours doesn't, your church has responded powerfully to the feminist revolution, obviously. Thank God. Thank you. Mine hasn't. Still, human institutions are always leaving us frustrated and restless and in need of criticism and in need of self-criticism. So I would say to those young people, make your conscientious choice, but consider staying with the Catholic Church if you're born into it, to change it, and choose to do that. I would compare it to being an American. I'm an American the same way I'm a Catholic. Look, I give you a litany of things that are wrong with the Catholic Church. Would you like me to give you my American litany? Things that this country is threatening the world with even as we speak. Start with the nuclear arsenal to which we are addicted as a people. Start with white supremacy, around which we have built an entire culture and structure of economy. So I could start, if I start looking for pure or correct or unchallengeable institutions to live, either religiously or patriotically, I'd be alone pretty quick. And even then, I'd still be stuck with a human being, wouldn't I?
Would indeed. And no, no church is perfect, no denomination, no tradition. I mean, to say the least, we are all fallible. We are all in the sight of God beloved, but far from perfect. I'm going to encourage folks, if they would like to ask a question, to go ahead and write it in. And in the meantime, and I want to again be careful of our time because I know we've just got a little bit, but I love when authors read, and I like to hear the words as they're read by the author. And I'm wondering if you would do us the honor of reading on page 82 the story of trying to catch the host and the host falling on the floor.
Well, you chose this passage. I'm glad you did. It's a memory that's powerful for me. This is the book, by the way.
Thank you for showing that. Yes.
Yeah.
I love
Yeah.
to encourage folks to read it. It is wherever you're at. If you are interested in history, philosophy, theology, personal biography, it's got it all. So please.
Now there's travel in there too, right?
Travel. Absolutely.
Right. Well, this is an instance, and I'm probably 7 or 8 years old. I'm remembering this. And I'm trying to, in this book, after I had this crashing moment of disillusionment when Pope Francis went to Ireland, I asked myself, how could I have given myself over to the priesthood? I was a priest for 5 years, as Laurie said, 1969 to 1974, just a brief minute, a lifetime ago, for goodness sake. And yet it stamps me still. And I had to ask the question, well, what was it? And what drew me to it? And when did I begin to get initiated into the dark side of this? And all of a sudden I remembered this moment. I love being an altar boy. It made me feel, it gave me a sense of religious meaning, actually, to be at the priest's side during the Mass, which is when I saw the meaning of the religion helping people who were suffering. So I love being an altar boy, and the altar boy's most sacred duty was to help the priest distribute communion. And in those days, the wafer, the host, was put on the tongue, the outstretched tongue of the person receiving communion along the altar rail. So the priest would go along the altar rail, distributing the host, the wafer, and the altar boy held a gold plate underneath the chin of each person receiving to catch the host in case it fell, because it was sacred. That was the altar boy's supreme duty. And this is a moment when, not to put too fine a point on it, when I blew it. And I'll tell you what happened. One early morning at Mass, I was the expert altar boy at the Monsignor's side as he distributed communion. In sync with each other, he and I moved rhythmically along the ornate brass rail. He placed the host on each communicant's tongue, and I dutifully held the paten, the gold plate, under the person's chin. We had done this together hundreds of times, but then he stumbled, just at the wrong moment. Lurching, he let go of the sacred wafer an instant too soon, and it began to fall away from the receiver's mouth. This was precisely the mischance that I was there to guard against, but I froze. By the time I tried to catch the host with the paten, it was already fluttering to the floor. I'd missed it, a sacrilege. I reached down to the unleavened white disc on the black linoleum, intending to rescue the body of Christ from the unclean floor by picking it up, an automatic, unthinking response fueled by my horror at having, after all my years as an altar boy, failed in this, my gravest responsibility. But if my unconsecrated fingers had touched the host, the sacrilege would have been compounded. Seeing that, Monsignor Stevens brought the heel of his stout, high-topped Irish peasant brogan down on my hand, smashing it. I remember looking up at him and the expression on his face. perspiration on his brow, hot, ferocious eyes, twisted mouth. It was one of such massive disapproval that I believed at once he had seen through to the very core of me. Now, that's an odd thing to remember, I admit. But there was a way in which I saw something in the Monsignor that was different from the idealistic vision I'd had until then of the priest. You could say it was my initiation into the humanity of my faith. My own humanity, I blew it. The priest's humanity, he acted cruelly in response to my mistake, which is not the way God would have acted. God would not have taken offense at the symbol of God, the host, being on the floor. After all, he created the linoleum floor too.
As I read that, I felt such pain, and not only just on your hand, I could feel the pain of standing on your hand, but also indeed the pain of what that must have felt like or emotionally and spiritually, and the ongoing pain that seems to feel you at times.
Laurie, you were very wise in picking that passage for me to read, because now that I think of it, of course, the Irish boot on my hand is a small, small instance of the being stomped upon that victims of priests have felt, that women insulted by this male supremacist institution have felt, that so many people abused by the power structure of the Catholic Church have felt, being stepped on. And 2 weeks ago, gay people in the church being stepped on by that cruel declaration from the Vatican. So here's an instance of what I'm responding to with this book, calling for change, calling for political reform, inviting Catholics to make it happen, especially a direct message to priests. Priests have the power, the real power, to change this clerical system, because they live inside it and know it and its need for change better than anybody.
I'm going to ask two more questions that have come up, and then we'll close here regretfully. But one of the questions that kind of jumps right on what you're talking about is asked, please reflect on the use of tests and restrictions regarding communion. The Catholic Church's high theology of communion reinforces clericalism rather than drawing on the image of the feeding of the masses on the hillside. Jesus didn't require test of orthodoxy or loyalty that day. He saw that they were hungry, and he told his followers to feed them. So he took bread, he blessed it, he broke it, and it was shared. It was communion.
Well, you're put that in front of us has done something very wise. It goes to the essence of the way in which the church has betrayed Jesus Christ. Absolutely right. Jesus did not have borders around the mercy and love he was offering. And as you point out, as this wonderful observation points out, Jesus defined his life. He defined his presence of the divine at the table by eating with people. And he ate with everybody who showed up. And his parables were about that. The master of the house going out into the street to bring people into the banquet table. Whoever's out there, come in. The people, the sinners, the tax collectors, the marginal people, come and eat with me. And how did the Christian movement get going? Eating with each other without any requirements. There's nothing more crushing than to be at a Catholic funeral today and have the priest, where the church is full. Well, of course, we don't have full churches right now, but before and after the COVID, we did and hopefully will. The priest saying to a church full of people who are there to pay respects for the person who's dead and to love their family, Many of them not Catholics. Many of them Congregationalists like you, Laurie. Many of them Church of Christ people, Episcopalians, whoever they are. And what do you hear from a Catholic priest today? By the way, those of you who are not Catholic, don't come to communion, because only baptized Catholics can go to communion. It is the most offensive, cruel, insensitive violation of the meaning of the religion that's never more palpable than at a funeral. What is our religion? God suffers with us. We suffer with each other. And that's how we make it through this life. Compassion. The violation of compassion around communion, as this person, questioner, observes so powerfully, is the essence of what's wrong with the church today.
Thank you for that. One last question, and then we will close. Actually, a friend of mine writes, as a Black Catholic, I was profoundly disappointed in the church's response or lack of response in this time of racial reckoning. 1 out of 7 white Catholics voted for Trump. Many priests are also preaching and believing that the Black Lives Matter movement is a terrorist group. It is easier to stay and try to stay when you're not a recipient of the racism, sexism, behavior. Your thoughts?
That observation is also crucial and must be emphasized. The failure of the Catholic Church to oppose white supremacy with power in America at this moment is egregious. And you're absolutely right to see the support for Donald Trump as an emblem of that. The Catholic bishops of the United States of America as a group tilted more to Trump than they did to Biden. And even now, there are Catholic bishops giving Biden trouble. Catholic bishops, as if Donald Trump is in any way to be supported by people of the church. Pope Francis himself stood against Trump in very clear and powerful ways.
Thank you.
Supremacy
I think
is the curse.
I'm afraid we might have lost you. You're freezing a little bit here.
And we white self-criticism.
Jim, it looks like we've lost you.
I think I've lost a bit of
So you know
sound.
what? I'm going to go ahead and just like close out your video and see if I can bring you back on, okay? Hang on, Laurie.
Okay.
Yeah, his signal. He's trying. There we go. There we are.
Welcome back, James. It's good to have you back. And
we will.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're still kind of.
I apologize for the glitch there.
That's okay, and it's probably time for us to end anyway. But this has been a powerful, meaningful afternoon with you, and I'm so grateful. And in the church that I serve, we've been using the words a lot of Phyllis Tribble, who has written that about every 500 years, the church goes through a giant rummage sale, which means that it takes a look at itself. It gets rid of the things that don't seem to be working or the things that kind of are holding us back. And we're kind of at that 500-year mark right now. Of course, the last one before that was the Reformation. And so I think we all hope, no matter what tradition that we come out of, that there is going to be a good old giant rummage sale where you get rid of stuff that has kind of held you back, or that's cluttered your home, or that has long lost its meaning for you, that we can move on with vision and a witness to the good news for us of Jesus. And that and his stand against the empire and the undeniable, unconditional love of God. And you said early on in the book that this is a journey from broken faith to chosen hope. And I'd love for you just to leave us with some words of hope, if you would, if you're able. Well, we may not be able to.
Jim, are you there?
Yeah.
You know, we
Yes.
can't see you,
Can
but
you hear me?
we can't see you, but we can hear you. So please.
Well, I apologize for the technological failure, but let me just close by thanking Laurie as an example of exactly the kind of a Christian witness that we're all looking for, and thanking Books and Books. It's a difficult subject. It's a difficult subject that I've written in this book, but it's also a difficult subject for all of us. How do we reckon with suffering, and how do we reckon with those who suffer far more than we do? And the message of mercy and compassion, suffering with, is our hope. My own Catholic faith is worthy of struggling to help it realize such a vision. I'm privileged to be a Catholic. I'm a repentant Catholic. And I feel all very privileged conversation.
Oh, Laurie.
I know they were powerful words and meaningful words. So let me again close this off and just say, if you have not yet read this book, please do. My cover is off because, as you can see, I have devoured this book with paper clips and turned pages and magic marker and so forth. But I highly recommend it. Christina, thank you again for your representation of Books and Books and the great events that you offer us. And to all who have joined us this afternoon, it's been an honor to be with you, and especially for me personally, to be with James Carroll. So thank you all so
Laurie,
much.
thank you so much. And thanks to our viewers for watching. I'm so sorry we lost Jim there at the very end. But this was an incredible conversation, very thought-provoking, lots of food for thought, for sure. As a recovering Catholic myself, I really welcome it. Thank you so much for your excellent moderating. And I'd just like to remind everyone who's out there that you can just hit the green button, order a copy of the book. We'll ship it right out to you. If you're in Miami and you want to come by one of our stores, we would love to see you. And Laurie, I do so hope that we will get to come back to the church soon again and bring James Carroll with us for a program in person.
At that time, we'll go for 2 hours because I have a lot more to say.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much to everyone watching. Bye. Have a great afternoon. Bye.